Today my topic is GDP, Gross Domestic Product. So what I'll take up a few questions on GDP, okay, and we'll try to answer them. Okay, so the first is, what is GDP? What is included? What is not included? And what are the components of GDP? So we'll try to answer these. So first of all, let me start with what is GDP. What do you understand by GDP? So GDP is nothing but the value of all final goods and services produced in an economy in a given period. Okay? So all the final value of all final goods and services produced within the domestic territory of a country in a given year is your GDP, right? So I'll have one more thing out here, domestic territory of a country. Okay, or within the, let's say, borders of a country. Okay, so in a given year is your GDP. All right. Okay, corresponding to this, there is a money flow in the resource market as well. That reflects the income payments. So let's say the income payment for your natural resources. Okay, the income payment for natural resources is your rent. So now, to give an example, let's say a natural resource, land. Okay, so if you lend a land to anyone, what you get is the rent on the land, right? So that's the income payment for the natural resource. Natural resource here, mainly we consider land. Okay, so land being one of your factor of production. Okay, now second, let's say if I talk of labor, that's another factor of production. So the income payment for labor that we take in economics is wages. Okay, so if somebody is giving labor services, what we pay is wages. Okay, then you have capital. So the income payment for capital here is the financial capital we are talking of, right? Is the interest that you get. Okay, and then you have the entrepreneurship. So if you are an entrepreneur and if you have skills, you have set up your own business, so in return what you get, so income payment for all that hard work is basically your profits. Oh, that's my sign for profits, so these are profits. Okay, so this will talk in further videos. Here we will just we will just talk about this in a very brief manner, okay, later in the video. So that's why I've introduced these, that okay, if we say that these are four factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, then these are rent, wages, interest, and profits are their respective income payments. All right. Okay, coming back to GDP, what we have is, so it's the value of all final goods and services that are produced within the domestic territory of a country in a given year. That's your GDP. Okay. All right. Now I'll just take few words from here. So final. So by final I mean final goods and services. I mean that what is not included in GDP is basically your intermediate goods. Okay, you know what are intermediate goods? Intermediate goods are the goods that are all resources that are used in order to produce the final goods and services. Okay, so let's say, if I take an example, let's say I have to bake a cake. So I have to bake a cake. So for baking a cake, there are many ingredients that are required. So let's say if I take one of the ingredients being sugar. So sugar now is my intermediate good in making this cake, right? So it's a kind of, a raw material that's involved in making a cake. Okay, so since it's an intermediate good, it will be used in making of the cake, so that's not counted. Okay, so intermediate goods are not counted in your GDP. What we count is only the final value of goods and services. So in our example, what we will take into consideration is the final cost of the cake, right? And not the costs involved in between, the costs of the ingredients that are used in making that cake. Okay, all right, so that's why it's only the final goods and services, value of all final goods and services that we take. Second is that I'll take this word of production. So goods and the value of all final goods and services produced, right? So produced, by produced here I mean that they need not be consumed. So need not be consumed. However, since they are produced, so they will be included in your GDP even if they are not consumed. But since they have been produced, so they would be included in the GDP in that given year of their production. Okay. The third word that I would like to take is your domestic territory. Okay. Now, it does not matter in domestic territory, it doesn't mean that only the local companies or the domestic companies we are talking of. We are talking of even the foreign companies, okay? So, it does not matter who owns the factory, whether it's owned by Indians or whether it's owned by, let's say, US, right? If a US, brand is operating in India, is having a factory in India, and if its production is done in India, then that production is counted as part of Indian GDP, right? Okay, so to make that simple, if I take an example of Coca-Cola, okay, so Coca-Cola is a foreign brand, and Coca-Cola sets up a factory in India, and it's producing, Coca-Cola cold drink bottles. So that production is counted as part of India's GDP. So no matter who owns the factory, if the factory is in the domestic territory of a country, then that's counted in the GDP of that country. Okay, so this is your basic definition of what is GDP. All right. Okay, now let's come to the part that what is included. So I told you what's included. It's including the value of final goods and services produced, and it includes your anything that's produced within the domestic territory of a country. Even if it's not consumed, the production is done, so that's included. Okay. What is not included, apart from one or two things that we have talked about here, like intermediate goods. Okay, what's not included is, first I'll again go with not included in GDP. The first thing is your, let's say, intermediate goods. Okay, so that's not included because I'll give you the reason why it's not included. It's not included, why? Because if I include the value of sugar, then in my example of baking a cake, then that would be double counting the value of sugar, right? Because when my final good is produced, I will obviously add the value of sugar to that value of cake also. So it's counted when I bought it, it's counted when I'm selling it. So it would be a kind of a double counting for that one product, right? So in order to avoid that double counting, the value of intermediate goods is not included. Okay. Second, what's not included is basically your household production. Okay, so let's say the household chores, right? Household chores done by homemakers, right, is not included in your GDP of a country. Okay, which is sad, right? I mean, very sad for all the moms who are homemakers, right? So that's not included in your GDP. Then what's not included is illegal activities, which is fair enough. So the illegal activities are not included in your GDP. Then what's not included is also your transfer payments. Now transfer payment is any kind of payment that's done for social purposes and not for the production of goods and services. So to give you an example of transfer payment is like unemployment benefits, right? Or your pensions, right? Or your subsidies, right? All these are your transfer payments. So transfer payments, these all are done not because the other person has done some productive activity or the production of goods and services has taken place, but it's mere transfer of funds for social purposes, right? So unemployment benefits to those who are unemployed so that they can survive at least, right? Pensions to those who have got retired, right? And so they have a certain amount of income in order to carry on their day-to-day living. Subsidies in order to make people come out, at least just give them a little extra money so that or make things a little less costlier for them so that they can afford them, right? So that's your social purposes for which the transfer payments are made. Payments made for social purposes and not for production of goods and services. So that's perfectly fine. So that's not counted in your GDP. And the first and the fifth one is that any environmental damages, right, or destruction or any external cost, like let's say noise, right, or any other damage to the environment, let's say chopping off the trees, right, deforestation or something like that because of building off your factories or malls or whatever, right? So that environmental damage or external cost or anything that sort of is not included in GDP. Okay. All right. I mean, it's a very long discussion if I go into the depth of all these and discuss whether they should not be or should be included in GDP. I'm not going into that. But I'm just telling you that yes, these are few of the things that are not included in GDP. So intermediate goods, household production, illegal activities, transfer payments, and environmental damage or external cost is not included in GDP. All right. And then we have, the calculation of GDP. So there are basically three methods of calculating GDP, right? In this video, I am not going into the depth of what are the three, how are we calculating GDP. What I'm just giving you a brief explanation of, yes, that there are three methods of calculating GDP. Okay. All right. So the first method that we talk of is value-added methods, right? So it's the value-added method. So in this, it's only the value addition of the good that's added and that gives us the GDP, right? I'm not going into the depth of these methods right now. Okay, the second is your income method. Now here I will just talk about on my first page, what I had written about the income payments, right? So it's like income method is basically the one that where I calculate all the income payments that we get from different factors of production. So here I will add this rent plus my wages plus my interest and plus my profits. All these basically give me my factor payments, right? And this gives me my national income of the country. So from that we derive our GDP. Okay. All right. Okay, coming back to this page where I talk of the third method is basically my final output purchased. Now, final output purchased is basically my expenditure method, right? Now, here I take into the value of purchases made by final users, okay? So, what are the value of purchases that are made by the final users that I add up and I get the GDP? Now, the beauty is that whether you take value added method, income method, or final output method, all three will give you the same GDP. Here and there, right? Errors and omissions, okay? Right? And this, why this I have explained in the circular flow of income of my macroeconomic video earlier, right? So you can go back to that video and refer to it for this, okay? All right. Then you have what are the components of GDP? That's my last part, right? Or how is GDP divided? So GDP is divided into 4 components. The first is your consumption. So C stands for your consumption. So consumption is basically from the household sector, right? Then you have the investment. So investment is basically from your private sector, right? So it would have your plant and equipment, it would have new homes constructed for household, it would have change in inventories, right? So all that is your investment. The third component would be your government expenditure or government outlays for goods and services. Now this would not be the transfer payments, right? Because they are not included in GDP. This would be the expenditure by the government on, let's say, education, on, let's say, your law and order, right? So all that is any expenditure by the government on these, basically on infrastructure, on education, on law and order, would be the government expenditure infrastructure. All right. And then the fourth is basically your net exports. So net exports is your exports minus your imports, right? Exports are part of production, so they are added in GDP, right? So when you are exporting, you are producing, there's a production activity going on, and then there's an exchange of payment for that, right? So it's added in GDP, that's why. Imports, your income is going out, so that's why it's subtracted from your GDP. All right, so this is how the GDP is divided, or these are the components of GDP. To summarize it again, it's your consumption, it's your investment, it's your government expenditure, and it's your net exports. All right, now the last part, I just want to touch that part, right? I'll just give one explanation, right? So it's like, what does GDP, what's the problem with GDP, okay? What's the problem with GDP? Okay, so is it a good indicator of economic development, or it's not a good indicator of economic development? That's again a whole very debatable topic, right? So one problem of GDP, I'll just cite here. What's one problem with GDP is that it does not reflect. So it does not. So I'll just make it very bold. It does not reflect distribution of wealth, right? So it does not reflect distribution of wealth. Now that's the major problem of GDP, all right? So we know that, okay, there are a few things that are not included in GDP, all that is also a problem. But yes, one of the major problem with GDP is that it does not reflect the distribution of wealth. So by just looking at the GDP, you cannot say about the distribution of wealth in an economy. It might be that, a section of the society is getting a much larger share of the income of the country, right? And a much larger proportion of the economy is getting a very small share of the income of the country, right? So it does not give us that. It does not give us that. The GDP does not tell us that. So that's the major problem of GDP. All right. Okay. See you next time. Bye bye.